For the surface transportation, we've come up with a great bill for transit safety, and I'm going to be happy to vote for it. Let's get Congress rolling so we can get our economy rolling. Madam President, I yield the floor. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Mr. A quorum call on the floor of the Senate this morning. The Senate did gavel in at 9:30 Eastern for morning business. They've been offering general speeches. At noon, the Senate will resume consideration of the nomination of Alaberto Jose Jordan of Florida to be United States Circuit Judge for the 11th Circuit. A couple of minutes later, at about 12:02, the Senate is expected to vote on the confirmation of the Jordan nomination. And after that, more work on the Surface Transportation Bill. And further voting is expected, likely on amendments to surface transportation. The House also gavelled in this morning at 10 o'clock. Members are offering general speeches right now. Legislative business will get underway at noon Eastern, starting with an hour of general debate on part of the Surface Transportation Bill. House leadership initially planned to finish the bill this week. CQ is reporting this morning that the House is now not likely to complete work on the Surface Transportation Bill. Speaker Boehner has decided to complete consideration after next week recess, an aide said this morning. More time would be needed to comb through the hundreds of amendments that have already been offered, according to the Boehner aide, who said that the Speaker was committed to an open process. The aide also said lawmakers needed time to examine their options for offsetting the bill's cost because a proposal involving federal employees' pensions is also being used in a package that would extend a Social Security payroll tax cut and other expiring provisions. Again, you can see the House live on our companion network, C-SPAN, this morning, and of course the Senate right here on C-SPAN, too.
President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Madam President, I ask the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor today because of a new report that's come out by the chief economist of Gallup, the polling organization, dated today, February 15th, 2012. And the headline is Health Costs, Government Regulations Curb Small Business Hiring. Madam President, as a member of the Senate, as well as a physician who's taken care of families across the state of Wyoming for about a quarter of a century, I'm concerned about jobs in this country, the economy of this country, and also the health care needs of the American people, which is why week after week I come to the Senate floor with a doctor's second opinion about a health care law that was supposed to give people what they were looking for, which was the care they need from the doctor that they want at the cost they can afford. And regrettably, what this President and this Senate and this House at the time controlled by the Democrats gave them was something very, very different. So the result of this report today, first line, U.S. small business owners who aren't hiring, and that's 85% of the 600 who were surveyed. Those small business owners who aren't hiring are being asked why not. Well, nearly half of the small business owners point to the potential health care costs and government regulations as two big reasons. Those worried about the potential cost of health care, 48%. Those worried about new government regulations, 46%. But yet, when the President addressed the nation about health care, what he promised was that if people liked the care they had, they could keep it, and they would see their premiums drop by $2,500 a year a family. Now, when I have town hall meetings, I ask people how many believe that the health care costs are going to go up as a result of the health care law. Every hand goes up in the room. So the President has misled the American people, both in terms of the cost of the health care law, as well as he misled the people in regard to regulations. He has stood in front of us in the House of Representatives as he gives the State of the Union and talks about removing expensive regulations. But that's not what the small business owners, those who create jobs in this country, it's not what they're finding. And then the President came out with his budget on Monday. It's his fiscal year 2013 budget, and as I've said before, it is debt on arrival. The Obama budget spends $3.8 trillion. It runs a deficit of nearly $1 trillion. It raises taxes by nearly $1.9 trillion. It is the largest tax increase in the history of our country, and it is the fourth year in a row to run a deficit of over $1 trillion, and yet the President goes on. To me, this is another clear example of President Obama's lack of leadership and his bad habit of saying one thing and doing the exact opposite. Instead of saving money, which he promises, he just spends more. Instead of leveling with the American people about our fiscal future, he misleads them. So today I'd like to focus on one specific part of this budget. It's the part referring and regarding the President's health care law. As you all remember, the President promised the American people repeatedly, not just once, but repeatedly, that his health care reform wouldn't add a dime to the deficit. 2 years later, the American people know that that's just not true. In fact, the President's new budget request asks for almost $1 billion. $1 billion. That's 1,000 million. $1 billion to fund his health care exchange. As the Hill newspaper recently reported, quote, the health reform law did not set aside any money specifically for the creation of the federal exchange. Let me repeat. The health care law did not set aside any money specifically for the creation of the federal exchange. 2 years ago, did the President and my friends on the other side of the aisle seriously believe that Washington would be able to implement an unprecedented health care exchange for free? Would it just be free? Well, of course not. But the fact is they knowingly knowingly ignored the costs of the president's major new entitlement program. Why? Well, to try to score a political victory. What do we know about that victory? Well, we know that it is going to be bad for patients, bad for the providers, the nurses and doctors who take care of those patients, and bad for the American taxpayers. We know that the health care law, when it was crammed down the throats of the American people, forced through Congress, we know that it was unpopular then, and we know that it is even more unpopular today. You know, the whole time that the Democrats were drafting the bill behind closed doors right outside this Senate chamber, they knew that it would cost American taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. But they didn't want to admit it. They did not admit it. They refused to admit it. So they shaded the numbers, punted the problem down the road. So here we are now, 2 years later, and now they're finally trying to pay for it. It's listed in the president's budget. To make matters worse, the 2013 Obama budget wants to spend $290 million for, quote, consumer beneficiary education and outreach, close quote, within the exchanges. What does this mean? Well, basically means that they want to educate Americans about the exchanges and the health care law to the tune of $290 million of taxpayer dollars. Well, I think it is important to keep the American people informed, but my question is, why are President Obama and the Democrats in Congress focused on educating people about the health care law now? Why? Why didn't they take the time 2 years ago to educate the American people about the exchange and the costs of doing it? Well, we know the reason. The reason is because they knew that the American people would never support the new law, would never give up their freedoms. Instead, the White House and Democrats in Congress covered up the costs, drafted the bill behind closed doors, and jammed it through Congress. Well, now the financial bills are coming due. But, Madam President, the checks are not in the mail. The United States is running out of money and running out of money fast. Instead of proposing a serious budget that would get our country back on the right track, the President has put forward not a serious budget, but a campaign document. No matter what he says, he is much more interested in winning votes now than in winning what he calls the future. Earlier this week, the President spoke to students at a community college, and he said that his budget would make their futures brighter. Well, I watched on television as he did that, and his words really couldn't have been further from the truth. The fact is that the President and his budget will make these students have to work even harder to pay off the nation's increasingly growing debt. These students and all future generations of Americans will pay for the choices that they never made and programs that they don't want. The new $800 million price tag on the exchanges is bad, and that is just the beginning. In fact, the cost of the President's health care law is going to continue to skyrocket each and every year. When we're already $15 trillion in debt, we can't allow this health care law to move forward. When we look at trillion-dollar deficits for each of the 4 years of the Obama presidency, we say this cannot continue. And yet when you look at this budget, it adds $11 trillion to the national debt over the next 10 years. We need to repeal this health care law. We need to replace it with something that will not make it harder for future generations to get out of debt, and we need to pass a law that will allow Americans to get what they wanted in the first place, the care that they need from a doctor that they want at a price they can afford. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, is the chamber under a quorum call?
Yes, it is.
I ask the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to draw my colleagues' attention to an issue of great importance to our rural communities. If Congress does not act, many of our rural counties will face an increasingly dire state of affairs in the months to come. Across the United States, these timber counties are facing local budgets suddenly and deeply in the red. This fiscal crisis could mean reduced school days, fewer sheriffs, more offenders on the street, and cuts to other basic county services. Now, Congress has the power to avert this impending disaster, and Congress must utilize that power. So we must act without delay to extend the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act. Secure Rural Schools is not an entitlement program. It is a commitment that this nation, our federal government, made to rural forest counties out of fairness and common sense when it determined that it would put environmental overlays over large blocks of forest land that were dedicated to timber production with revenue shared with the local counties. This contract between the federal government and our rural counties has been a foundation of our national forest system, and we in this chamber need to honor it. Many folks come here and talk about how the federal government needs to uphold its share of the bargain. Well, this is an explicit contract with our rural counties, and we need to uphold that bargain. Since 1908, more than 100 years, the federal government has appropriately shared timber revenues with counties for the infrastructure that they develop because this timberland is in federal hands and produces no property tax revenue to support that infrastructure. Let me give you some background on what the scale of this issue is for states like Oregon. Oregon has 2.2 million acres of O&C lands. These lands were granted to the Oregon-California Railroad in 1866 and later reverted to the federal government when the railroad failed to live up to its terms of the grant. They also included a class of lands that originated from a similar situation, the Coos Bay Wagon Road lands. These lands make up a large percentage of the acreage in southern and western Oregon. Then there are Forest Service lands, timbered lands owned by the Federal Forest Service that make up 14 million additional acres across the state of Oregon. When you add it all together, more than half of Oregon's lands are federally owned. That means they don't produce a penny of property tax to support infrastructure in our rural counties. The O&C lands and the Wagon Road lands were dedicated to timber production when the counties received 50% of all revenues. Counties with national forest lands received 25% of the timber revenues. This created jobs and a source of money to provide counties with that needed infrastructure. In the early 1990s, timber production began a long decline, a precipitous decline. Trends like automation and trade hit the sector hard as they had so many more sectors, and on top of this, there was the environmental overlays that dramatically reduced timber harvesting. To compensate for the newly imposed federal structure that changed the entire pattern of timber production in our rural counties, our national government produced the Secure Rural Schools program. It provides payments to counties that were based on historic timber harvest levels and were no longer tied directly to annual timber harvest. This type of arrangement is not unique to Oregon, nor are the problems arising from the lapse of the Secure Rural Schools program. There are a great many states, particularly in the West, where much of the land is federally owned and whose counties rely on this program and similar programs to support key infrastructure. It is no wonder when the Secure Rural Schools payments lapsed in 2006, drastic measures had to be taken to adjust for the loss. Let me give you some sense what this is like in Oregon. In Josephine County, southern Oregon, 2/3 of the county's general fund come from county payments. So loss of county payments means cutting public safety programs, Overnight in 2006, patrols were cut down to just 6 individuals to cover an area the size of the state of Rhode Island. In Lake County, where federal lands make up 61% of the county, they cut their federal road department from 42 individuals to 14. 14 folks for a road department covering a land area equal to the combined size of Connecticut and Delaware. In Jackson County, where 1/3 of the general fund comes from federal payments, the county eliminated 117 jobs in parks and human services and roads and public safety, and they closed all of their libraries. So let me be clear. When the federal government fails to uphold the contract that is struck with our rural timber counties, the suffering is intense. It is an embarrassment that we would allow the federal government to not fulfill its commitment under this framework. This impact so substantial that the Oregon legislature, when I was serving as Speaker, redirected $50 million in transportation funds to the rural counties. I, that year, 2007, organized a tour, bipartisan tour, bicameral tour of our most affected counties. We went out and talked with the county officials. It's when we came back that I advocated for and we supported this $50 million emergency transfer to compensate for the fact the federal government was breaking their contract with the timber counties in America. Let's not let that happen again. Later, Congress restored this contract. But now here we are, 5 years later, facing the worst-case scenarios all over again. As Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. Because we failed to pass an extension before we left for the holidays, the last payment occurred a few weeks ago, and timber counties don't know what's going to happen now. They'd like to think that folks in this chamber honor and support sustaining this federal contract with our rural timber counties. But this chamber has to act to make that happen. Eugene Register-Guard recently wrote an editorial about the situation in Lane County that, quote, the emerging picture looks like a multi-car pileup on Interstate 5. Lane County is facing a $14 million shortfall. More than half of this, $7.2 million, will have to be absorbed by the Sheriff's Office. What does that mean for Lane County? It means the end of 24-hour patrols, coverage just limited to 16 hours a day. It means so few officers that they'd be unable to respond except, quote, to the most serious of crimes, unquote. It means parole and probation supervision would be eliminated for hundreds of offenders, and 130 jail beds would have to be closed. In addition, the District Attorney's Office faces a $1.9 million reduction in county funding, which would mean the loss of between 12 to 20 employees in the criminal division and potential shutdown of the county's medical examiner's office. And this is one of the counties that is in better shape. Others could go bankrupt as early as June of this year. As the Register-Guard newspaper says, it's, quote, a dire predicament and in desperate need of help from Congress. Rural counties in Oregon and elsewhere deserve to have the federal government honor their contract and to have peace of mind that the funds guaranteed to pay for the infrastructure are there, for the roads, for schools, for public safety. In this contract between the federal government and rural America, the federal government must uphold its end of the bargain. Rural counties have been on a roller coaster for far too long. They've been flying off the tracks. Pick any metaphor you want. A pileup on I-5, a roller coaster, a train running off the tracks. This is a situation in our rural timber counties. And those members who don't have rural counties, they have other situations where there are vital federal commitments. This one must be honored by this chamber. So the first step is to extend the Secure Rural Schools program as soon as possible. And President Obama has supported and proposed and included in his budget a 5-year reauthorization of Secure Rural Schools and has made it mandatory spending. This short-term funding is a critical bridge to maintain schools and law enforcement in timber counties while we work for a viable, long-term, sustainable management solution for federal forests. I want to be clear. Timber counties would rather have forest practices that allow sustained production of timber as these lands were dedicated to. That creates jobs. That supports the whole supply chain. It provides logs to the independent mills that don't own their own forest land. This is the vitality of rural communities. My father worked at a sawmill when I was born, Harbor Plywood, in Riddle, Oregon. And I lived in the adjoining town of Myrtle Creek.
Senator's time's expired.
Thank you. I'll conclude, Madam President. Those of us with a timber background understand the essential nature of this federal contract. We must get it done in this chamber. I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Madam President.
Lee.
Madam President.
Sure.
Senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I think the Senator from Oregon may have a consent he wants to ask.
Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you to my colleague from Tennessee.
Thank you. Madam President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Madam President, I ask consent to speak in morning business for 10 minutes, and would you please let me know when 8 minutes have expired?
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, there are reports in some of the newspapers this morning that there's an effort to try to slip into the negotiation about extending the payroll tax break for the next year. A big loophole for the rich and for the investment bankers and for most of the people that President Obama keeps talking about as people whose taxes he'd like to raise. What I mean by this is I have heard that there may be an effort to put in the payroll tax agreement a 4-year extension of the so-called production tax credit, which is a big tax break for wind developers. I cannot think of anything that would derail more rapidly the consensus that is developing about extending the payroll tax deduction than to do such a thing. We're supposed to be talking about reducing taxes for working people. This would maintain a big loophole for investment bankers, for the very wealthy, and for big corporations. We hear a lot of talk about federal subsidies for big oil. I'd like to take a moment to talk about federal subsidies for big wind. $27 billion over 10 years. That's the amount of federal taxpayer dollars between 26 and 2017, according to the Joint Tax Committee, that taxpayers gave to wind developers across our country. The subsidies come in the form of a production tax credit, renewable energy bonds, investment tax credits, federal grants, and accelerated depreciation. These are huge subsidies, Madam President. And what do we get in return for these billions of dollars of subsidies? The production tax credit itself has been there for 27 years. It was a temporary tax break put in the law in 1992. What do we get? We get a puny amount of unreliable electricity which arrives disproportionately at night when we don't need it. And, Madam President, Americans are finding out in community after community that these are not your grandma's windmills. These gigantic turbines, which look so pleasant on the television ads paid for by the people who are getting all the tax breaks, look like an elephant when they're in your backyard. In fact, they're much bigger than an elephant. They're 3 times as tall as the skyboxes at Neyland Stadium, the University of Tennessee football stadium in Knoxville. They're taller than the Statue of Liberty in the presiding officer's home state. The blades are as wide as a football field. You can see the blinking lights for 20 miles. And in town after town, American residents are complaining about the noise and disturbance that come from these giant wind turbines in their backyards. There's a new movie that was reviewed in the New York Times in the last few days called Windfall, about upset residents in upstate New York who have left their homes and because of the arrival of these big wind turbines. The great American West, which conservationists for a century have sought to protect, has become littered with these giant towers. Boone Pickens, an advocate of wind power, says he doesn't want them on his own ranch because they're ugly. Senator Kerry, Senator Kennedy, Senator Warner, Senator Scott Brown all have complained about the new development, which will be the size of Manhattan Island, which will forever change the landscape off the coast of Nantucket Island. And on top of all that, these giant turbines have become a Cuisinart in the sky for birds. Federal law protects the American eagle. Exxon had to pay $600,000 in fines in 2009 when oil spills harmed the American eagle. But the federal government so far has refused to apply the same federal law to big wind that applies to big oil, even though chopping up an eagle in a wind turbine couldn't be any better than its landing and dying on an oil slick. 400,000 birds a year. We've had some experience with the reliability of this kind of wind power in the Tennessee Valley Authority region. TVA a few years ago built 30 big wind turbines on top of Buffalo Mountain. In the eastern United States, these only work on the most scenic mountains. So you'll see them along the areas near the Appalachian Trail. They're the mountains, the scenic views we prize in our state. But there they are, 30 big wind turbines to see whether they would work. Here's what happened. The wind blows 19% of the time. According to TVA's own estimates, it's reliable 12% of the time. So TVA signed a contract to spend $60 million to produce 6 megawatts of wind, actual production of wind, over that 10-year period of time. It was a commercial failure. Madam President, there are obvious better alternatives to this. First, there's nuclear power. We wouldn't think of going to war in sailboats if nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers were available. Well, the energy equivalent of going to war in sailboats is trying to produce enough clean electricity for the United States of America with windmills. The United States uses 25% of all the electricity in the world. It needs to be clean, reliable electricity that we can afford. 20% of the electricity we use today is nuclear power. Nearly 70% of the clean electricity, the pollution-free electricity we use today, is nuclear power. It comes from 104 reactors located at 65 sites. Each reactor consumes about 1 square mile of land. To produce the same amount of electricity by windmills would mean you'd have to have 186,000 of these wind turbines. It'd cover an area the size of West Virginia. You'd need 19,000 miles of transmission lines through backyards and scenic areas. So 100 miles of reactors on 100 square miles, 100 reactors for 100 square miles, 186,000 wind turbines on 25,000 square miles. Or think about it another way. 4 reactors on 4 square miles will equal a row of 50-story wind turbines along the entire 2,178-mile Appalachian Trail. And of course, if you had the turbines, you'd still need the nuclear plants, or the gas plants, or the coal plants, because you'd like your computers to work and your lights to be on when the wind doesn't blow and you can't store the electricity. And then, of course, there's natural gas, which has no sulfur pollution, very little nitrogen pollution, half as much carbon as coal. Gas is very cheap today. A Chicago-based utility analyst said wind on its own without incentives is far from economic unless gas is north of $6.50 per unit. So that's why the Wall Street Journal says that the wind power companies are on pins and needles. waiting to see what Congress decides to do about its subsidy. Thank you very much. Taxpayers, I would submit, should be the ones on pins and needles. This $27 billion over 10 years is a waste of money. It could be used for energy research. It could be used to reduce the debt. Let's start with the $12 billion over that 10 years that went for the production tax credit. That tax credit was supposed to be temporary in 1992. Today, according to Secretary Chu, wind is a mature technology. Why does it need a credit? The credit is worth about 3 cents per kilowatt hour if you take into account the corporate tax rate of 35%. It's caused some energy officials to say they've never found an easier way to make money. Well, of course not. So we do not need to extend the production tax credit for wind at a time when we're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar, at a time when natural gas is cheap and nuclear power is clean and more reliable and less expensive. I would like to see us put some of that money on energy research. We only spend $5 or $6 billion a year on energy research, clean energy research, carbon recapture, making solar cheaper, making electric batteries that go further. But let's stop the subsidies or reduce the debt. And I'm ready to reduce the subsidies for big oil as long as we reduce the subsidies for big wind at the same time. So let's not even think about putting this tax break for the rich in the middle of an extension of a tax deduction for working Americans this week. Let's focus on reducing the debt, increasing expenditure for research, and getting rid of the subsidies. 27 years is long enough for a wind production tax credit for what our distinguished Nobel Prize-winning Secretary of Education says is a mature technology. Madam President, I would like to ask consent to introduce into the record a film review from the New York Times on February 3rd entitled Turbines in the Backyard, the Sound and the Strobes. This is about the movie Windfall, about upstate New York communities who've experienced having these huge things in their backyard. An article by Robert Bryce on why the wind industry is full of hot air and costing you big bucks, and an article from the Los Angeles Times on wind farms, and another article from February 2nd in the Globe about how